Hello and welcome everyone to our third lecture of this lecture series. My name is Taimur and I'm an attorney at law. So today we're going to be talking about the US Constitution, some of the interesting features of the US Constitution and its historical background. The US Constitution was ratified in the year 1789, and being 228 years old, it is broadly considered to be the world's longest surviving written constitution. Comprising of only 7 articles, it laid down the national frame of the government of some 13 colonies in the 18th century. But one very important question arises: where did these 13 colonies come from? So in the later part of the 16th century, great powers such as Great Britain, France, Spain and the Dutch launched major colonial programs in the eastern part of North America. The European settlers that came to this new land represented different social and religious backgrounds. Some actually fled and traveled across the Atlantic only to escape religious persecution from the Church of England. You see, in our last lecture we talked about King Charles I, in whose reign Oliver Cromwell came and there was English Civil War, and for a very brief period of time Great Britain became a republic. Now the father of Charles I was James VI of Scotland, or was regarded as James I, King of England. And he got the crown in the year 1603 when Queen Elizabeth died without producing any heir, mainly because she never got married to anyone. Now Queen Elizabeth was the second daughter of King Henry VIII, who again is a very important historical figure. You see, King Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was Roman Catholic. She was from Spain. But he was so hell-bent upon producing a male heir that when he discovered that he wasn't able to have one, he wanted to get a divorce. But in those days, the only way that he could get a divorce was if the Pope annulled the marriage. And the problem here was that the Pope happened to be none other than the nephew of Queen Catherine, who wouldn't give such. And so just so to get a divorce, King Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself as the head of the Anglican Church, and now there was an English church, and he eventually got his divorce. And so his eldest daughter, when she took over, Queen Mary, she supported the religion of her mother, and many people were actually burned alive because they refused to follow Rome. But her reign was rather short-lived, and so the crown came to the domain of Queen Elizabeth, who again supported her father's religion, and so English Church was something that would remain. But when James I finally took over, he said that no one shall be allowed to carry out any private religious ceremonies, and that he made it a crime for anyone who did not belong to the English Church. Now this was very problematic for a great many different factions and sects who perhaps didn't follow see eye to eye with the Roman Catholic practices. The initial pilgrims, the separatists, the Puritans, as well as the Roman Catholics had no other option but to go to some other land where they would be away from the reach of the Church of England, and they could embrace and follow their religion in any way that they deemed as fit. And so many of the settlers started moving to this new land which was discovered by Christopher Columbus and so. And some of them settled in West Virginia mainly, Boston. The province of Maryland was considered as the safe haven for many Roman Catholics. Now by the year 1760, which was after the 7 Years' War, which again was another skirmish between France and Great Britain and involving certain Indian tribes, by 1760 France lost, and all of its colonies now were to come under the domain of the British. And so these 13 British colonies were now under the domain of Great Britain, and they were called as the North American British colonies. By the end of the 7 Years' War, the British government had incurred a great deal of debt in fighting off the French. And even after the 7 years of war, some British soldiers were required to be stationed at the American colonies just to maintain peace. Now this was all costing a great deal of money, and so the British government felt that it would only be fair if the American colonists in these colonies were to pay up and pitch in. And so in a great series of different laws which were passed by the Parliament, taxes were levied on different objects, including the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, which stated that every instrument has to be stamped, and so the stamp duty would be paid to the British Crown. Another such measure was the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, which among other provisions, it levied taxes on paper, oil, glass, and tea. Now, tea back then was considered a very precious commodity, and British East India Company, a company which we will talk about in more detail in our next lectures, was primarily engaged in the trade of tea. Now, at that time, the British East India Company was also running a great deal of debt. They owed a lot of money to the British Crown, and they were not making enough money from India. And so, because for every shipment that they made to Great Britain, they had to pay tax, so the Parliament came to their aid, and there was a passing of the Tea Act of the 1773, which, even though it didn't impose any new taxes, because the tax on tea was in effect since the passing of the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, but it gave and granted the British East India Company a monopoly and the exclusive right to ship and trade in tea at the American colonies, and they wouldn't have to pay any taxes to the British Crown, so it was very feasible for them. But back then, tea was being smuggled in the colonies through Dutch and through other outlets, and there were a lot of middlemen, merchants involved in the business of tea. So with the passing of this new act, what it did was that it undercut the American middlemen who were involved in the business of smuggling and engaging and selling tea directly or indirectly, a measure which they didn't approve, and resentment further grew a whole lot afterwards. There was a famous incident of the Boston Tea Party. This happened at the end of 1773, when a group of American colonists in Boston, they came and boarded some 3 ships that were anchored, that had come with the shipments of tea, and they threw away 92,000 tons of tea as a mark of their protest. You see, their argument was that we as Englishmen are entitled to the same rights as an Englishman living in England that are given under the Bill of Rights of 1689. And the Bill of Rights of 1689 very clearly says that no new taxes can be levied without the consent of the Parliament. Since we as Englishmen are not represented, are not part of that Parliament, taxation cannot be imposed on us by the British Parliament. They had a very important and a very famous slogan: no taxation without representation. But against such measures, coercive and intolerable acts of 1774 was passed by the British Parliament. And they also engaged in a blockade at the port of Boston that no ships were allowed to ship in. And against such brutal measures, the First Continental Congress was called in the year 1774. 55 delegates joined in, coming from some 12 states, and they talked about this concern with the blockade and so on. And they signed a petition and sent it to King George III and stated that their grievances should be met and all sorts of taxes should be withdrawn. Even though by the year 1770 all taxes which had been levied by the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767 had been withdrawn, except for tea, the British felt that we're still going to have the tea tax on the books just to show that we have the right and that we would continue. Now, the First Continental Congress adjourned in the year 1774, but they said that we would come back in 1775 and inaugurate a new session if our demands were not met. Now, the Second Continental Congress was called in the year 1775, mainly because the colonists had learned that apart from our petition being considered by the king, our actions had been condemned, and the Parliament of Great Britain was not moving and it was not budging. And so even though there were talks ongoing about how the situation could be resolved, fighting started taking place, and now somewhat the war was inevitable. And as per many skirmishes which started in the year 1775, the period 1775 to 1783 represents the time frame when this war of independence was fought. Now, on the 2nd of July 1776, the Second Continental Congress approved of a resolution declaring that we are all independent states and we have nothing to do with Great Britain. And so afterwards they needed this resolution to be explained to the American public. And so they gave this task to Thomas Jefferson, who in his famous Declaration of Independence, which was adopted on 4th of July 1776, said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them would be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so started this period of war, and ultimately the United States won, and this was concluded by the Treaty of Paris in the year 1783, where King George III recognized the 13 independent states. Now, during the period of war in the year 1777, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, which by far are considered to be the first constitution of the United States. Now, in terms of these Articles of Confederation, during the wartime they may have served well, but after the war had ended, it was very difficult for the 13 colonies to be governed as a single unit. You see, since they were so wary of the whole king and the power resting in one person, they wanted independence, so much so that all states had their own currency in circulation. Now, the federal government didn't have any powers of their own. The federal government didn't have any power to impose tax, to collect tax, to coin a currency, to have a standing army. The fact of the matter is that any change required the amendment, the consent of all 13 states. It was impossible to get anything done. And this is exactly what happened. And many people predicted that this experiment, this new experiment of the American Revolution is but destined to fail, because they don't have any central figure. These states are just going to start fighting amongst each other, something which started taking place. One of such incidents was the Shays Rebellion. This took place in 1786 to 1787. There were a lot of debtors and creditors, and so the debtors grew angry and mob mentality took over, militiamen joined in, and ultimately all the debts were set aside under pressure, and people really started getting worried about this form of popular government, where the rights of the minority would simply be at the whims of the majority. People were very concerned with the way things were taking place. The situation was such that France actually sent 13 different ambassadors to 13 different states, because they didn't know where to send one ambassador. Now, there was also a rumor that the president of the Second Continental Congress even so as requested King Henry of Prussia to come and become their first king, because they felt that we are hopeless, we are not able to govern ourselves. And King Henry said that, Prince Henry, that you were not good to your last king, so he refused as such this offer. And at that time many people were of the view that it's better to have a limited form of monarchy, better the whims of one person rather than the ignorance and the passion of the mob. However, things changed in the year 1787. A constitutional convention was called at Philadelphia. At first people thought that the Articles of the Confederation were going to be revised, but ultimately it was a whole new constitution. New Hampshire was the 9th of the 13 states to ratify, and so the Constitution of the United States was to come into effect from the year 1789. After the war ended in the year 1783, General George Washington did something which was extraordinary. He returned his commission, surrendered it, and lived his retirement at Mount Vernon for about 8 years, something which was unheard of given how recent the historical accounts of Oliver Cromwell and perhaps even Julius Caesar were, that a person who has won the war against the great British would voluntarily give up his power. There was a famous saying that Napoleon on his deathbed said that they wanted me to be the next Washington. And when this was learned by King George III, he said that he would be the greatest man on the face of the planet if George Washington has done this. So when the Constitution was made effective, this comprised of only 4,500 words. Article 1 dealt with the legislative branch, which is primarily the Congress, to comprise of two houses, the lower house, House of Representatives, the upper house, Senate. Initially there was somewhat of a concern how the states should be represented, and they said that in the Senate each state would be equally represented and would have the right to have two senators from each state, whereas in the House of Representatives we would let the numbers be dictated and decided based on proportion of population. And the Congress was given all the powers to pass laws, to collect taxes, to impose taxes, to have a standing army, to regulate interstate trade, which is the Commerce Clause, and other ancillary powers. Article 2 dealt with the executive branch, wherein the President of the United States is the executive head. He is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The President has the power to make treaties so long as 2/3 of the senators standing agree to such a treaty. And Article 3 dealt with the judicial branch, that there will be a Supreme Court and other courts as established by the Congress. Article 4 talked about states, their rights with the federal government. Article 5 with the process of the amendment of the Constitution. In terms of Article 6, it was that the federal laws would trump the state laws. Article 7 again deals with ratification of how this instrument would be given effect to. All in all, this was considered to be a very short constitution. But by the end, when this constitution was being debated and it came into effect, a lot of concerns were raised. What about our liberties? What about the protections? The Federalists thought that you don't need any such protections because there is no such king. But the people, the anti-Federalists, felt that this is the proposal that the Federalists have laid before envisages a power greater than something which we had expected, a center which is so strong that if one day it were to turn tyrannical, the liberties of the states, of the people, would simply be up for grabs. And so they agreed on having an American Bill of Rights, which would comprise of the first 10 amendments. And this was ratified in the year 1791. Among them, the right to trial by jury, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and many other freedoms as outlined. Even though this held good only against federal law, but by virtue of the 14th Amendment, it also applied against state laws. Now, one would presume that there isn't just one US Constitution. All 50 states individually have their own state constitutions. You see, in the year 1776, the Continental Congress passed a resolution, Second Continental Congress, and encouraged each state to have their own constitution. South Carolina and New Hampshire had their own constitutions, which provided for certain changes. So the governor could have certain different limitation on his terms. Some states provided for only one legislature. And in some states they could actually elect their attorney general, they could even elect their judges. Some states even had codified the provision that they supported establishing a labor union. So the American Constitution was modeled on somewhat different principles from those of the Westminster style of parliamentary form of government. One of such principles was popular sovereignty, which actually meant that the authority or the right of a state is created or sustained by the consent of its people through the elected representatives, who are the source of the political power, something which even we follow. Some of the other principles were that they provided for a limited form of government, that the power of a branch or a government would be limited by law, as it would be a written constitution, much different from the British Constitution. And so, since there are three different branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary would have certain limitations of the things that they can and things that they cannot do. And they also introduced the concept of checks and balances, because they felt that if the three branches could run independently, the rights of the minorities would be rather at the whims of the majority. And so by putting these checks and balances in place and following the Montesquieu doctrine, they said that power could be checked, and that no branch of the government could be given so much power that it would trample upon and take away or assume the powers of the other branches, something which was very different from the Westminster style of parliamentary form. You see, in Great Britain, the parliament is the supreme lawmaking body of the country. It comprises of two houses. The House of Commons is both the legislature as well as the executive. The House of Lords till 1997 was considered as the highest appellate court, a part of judicial branch. So in a way, all three branches are squeezed up into one institution, which is something that the American colonists felt that we needed a somewhat a different model. And so by introducing the system of checks and balances, they ensured that liberty and freedom, something that they talked about, could be preserved, could be secured. Now we are going to wrap up our lecture here today, but the reason that we have covered the British Constitution as well as the American Constitution before we head and talk about the Constitution of Pakistan was so that we can understand better what the framers or the founding fathers in Pakistan felt and read and studied before they framed our constitution. And there are going to be certain other instruments which we would also refer to in some of our other lectures. So if there are any comments, again, please let us know. Thank you, and we will again see you very shortly.